This is without a doubt the most unique case I have ever worked on in my career.
When the 911 call came into the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office from a distressed mother reporting her son missing on January 10, 2013, Officer Craig Roby was immediately dispatched to the home to collect a statement from the reporter. The dispatch office also issued a Be on the Lookout, or BOLO, for KJ Johnson with a physical description of the boy and sent officers to the school to search the campus. They checked all the entrances and talked to anyone that they found nearby, but there was no sign of KJ.
If I remember correctly, his mom called shortly after midnight. The report was taken. Deputies went to Lowndes High School it had been that morning because it was after midnight, and searched the school property, rode around the areas they could see to make sure that he had not just gone to the basketball game and was hanging around the school for some reason, maybe waiting on a ride or hanging around with friends. I mean, there were any number of reasons that it could have been. If I remember correctly, they actually reached out to a couple of his friends that night, and nobody had seen him.
While researching for this podcast, I sat down and spoke with Dr. Thomas Aiello, a professor of history, Africana studies, and anthrozoology. If you listened to episode 1.5, you should already be quite familiar with him. I want to make it very clear that Professor Aiello's views do not reflect the views of anyone at this podcast or vice versa. We spoke to him as a reliable source on Valdosta, as well as Black history in general, not about Kendrick Johnson. If you don't like what we have to say, that's fine, but do not go and hassle him about our views simply because he was kind enough to lend us his time. Thank you. The following is a clip from that interview.
I'll go you one better. Valdosta actually doesn't have a school district. They have two school districts. They have one for Valdosta and then another for Lowndes County. The reason they did that is because once the Black population started reaching a critical mass, as it happens in all major urban areas in the United States, white people begin to flee and they move out into the county to get away from the city where the Black population has become the majority, and Valdosta has a Black majority because all the white people have moved outside of it. So instead of grouping the school district together like you normally would, a county school district for all the kids to go to school, we actually have two, and Valdosta High School is where all the people from the kids from the city go to school, which they're both integrated, but which is majority Black. And then you have the county school, which is its own separate district, which is majority white, so that we can have a largely white school board and a largely Black school board, and the students at the county school don't have to be under the leadership of a Black school board. You could pull up a school district map of Valdosta and Lowndes County, and it would look insane to you. I mean, there are literal carve-outs for like predominantly rich white neighborhoods in the city that are carved out of the Valdosta school district so that they can go to the Lowndes County school, so that they don't have to go to the predominantly Black school, that they are technically zoned for that, even though by any rational way of thinking, they would go to the school that's very close to their house. And these kinds of tropes, they get bled into the way that everyone thinks about themselves, their sense of place, their sense of worth and what constitutes value. And in those kind of cases, there's always going to be a winner and a loser. And the winners are always going to be white, and the losers are always going to be something else.
This wasn't something I'd come across in my research, but upon hearing it, a lot of lingering public confusion around this case suddenly came into perspective. So just in case anyone happens to be confused at this point, despite living in Valdosta, KJ did not attend Valdosta High School, and there is more than one high school in the area. I decided to look further into the statistics, and this is what I was able to come up with. According to datausa.io, in 2021, Lowndes County, Georgia had 61.9 thousand white residents and 43.5 thousand Black residents. Valdosta, Georgia had 19.3 thousand white residents and 31.2 thousand black residents. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in the 2022 to 2023 school year, there were 1,847 white students and 798 black students enrolled at Lowndes High School, and there were 1,810 black students and only 305 white students enrolled at Valdosta High School. Using the address on Jackie Johnson's police report, I was able to determine that the Johnsons' address was in the Valdosta High School district, and that should have been the school KJ was attending. If that had been the case, not only is it probably unlikely this would have happened at all, but if it had, it would have been investigated by an entirely different police force. The school administration would have been largely black, and there would not be the racial influence that being a black victim in a primarily white school comes with. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine why KJ was attending Lowndes County High School instead of Valdosta High School. The morning after KJ was reported missing, Lowndes High School Resource Officer Sergeant Mike Adams received the missing persons report from Officer Craig Roby. Adams drove over to the high school and asked the school secretary to verify whether or not KJ was in his first block class. Upon learning that KJ was absent, Adams asked if pictures of KJ could be photocopied so that the administration could start handing them around. The secretary informed Adams that Jackie and Kenyatta Johnson were actually already at the school in the guidance counselor's office. Adams proceeded there to see if there was more information he could obtain. Jackie and Kenyatta informed Adams that KJ didn't have a girlfriend, and the only person that he really hung around with very much was his cousin, who was a fellow student at the school, but he had been suspended, so he wasn't there the day KJ went missing. Adams requested dispatch send an officer to go over to the student's house, and once the officer was on site, he informed Adams that the student had not seen KJ since the last time Jackie had seen him the day before.
The case was assigned to detectives to follow up on the next morning. They were actually at the school following up on the missing person case when Kendrick was discovered.
According to a police report, the school guidance counselor said that while Jackie was in her office, she received a text and asked if the guidance counselor knew why there was a fire truck and an ambulance in front of the school. Lee Touchton, who, if you don't remember, was the leader of the NAACP investigation, provided the following summary in an interview. After this clip, we will go into more detail.
In the case file, it talks about Coach Pipolo, who had a class. Kendrick went missing third block on I can't remember the day. He went missing in his third block class. He didn't show up to his fourth block class, and then he was found, I believe, in the second block class of the very next day, and the coach was having class, and the children were filling out surveys. So two students got up on top of these mats. There were, like, if this is the wall of the gym, in fact, let me use this. If this is the gymnasium, there were these rolled up wrestling and cheerleading mats stacked in the corner like this, and they were 6 feet high. And right next to them was a low set of bleachers about 4 feet high. So the students would walk up on the bleachers, and then they'd get up on those mats and they'd sit, they'd lie down and all that. So they were filling out surveys, and two kids went up on the rolled up mats, and one of the girls said, "There's someone's feet down in the mats," and she screamed, and they got the coach got another boy, and they started pulling all these mats down. And there were about 15 or 20 of these mats stacked. You know how you might take Coca-Cola cans and push them up in the corner. So that's the way they were, stuck up in the corner of the gymnasium, and that had been done over Christmas break. This happened right after the kids came back to school. And so he was in one that was right up against the wall and very close to these bleachers. So they had to pull a whole bunch of them down before they could get to him. And then when they pulled him down, his body, by the force of the impact, his body shot forward a little bit. So when the EMTs came, this much of him was out the other end of the mat.
While Sergeant Mike Adams was with the school secretary printing out pictures of KJ to be handed out, in the part of the school known as the Old Gym, a physical science class was beginning. At some point, around 10:30 a.m., a couple of students climbed on top of some rolled-up wrestling mats standing up in the corner to lay down on them while the other students finished filling out a survey. The survey was interrupted when a student loudly called for everyone to come and see what she had found. As she peered into the center of one of the mats, she saw what appeared to be, quote, feet with white socks on them. According to a witness statement in the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office investigative file, a student did reach down into the mat and attempt to shake the foot. When the weight of the situation hit the students, one of them ushered over the gym teacher, Mr. Peploe, who climbed up on top of the mats and also saw the feet inside. In one of the police reports, Peploe's statement says that he could not move the person, and from that statement, many people have assumed that that meant he touched the body. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any documents or recordings where this is clarified, and several people we spoke to who were close to the investigation wanted to remain off the record. But from all of the interviews that we did and information that we found, Peploe did not touch the body. He determined that he would be unable to move it simply by looking at it. The students and faculty involved in the discovery couldn't tell that KJ was deceased in the mat, so they rushed to rescue him by moving the other 200-pound mats out of the way as fast as they could so they could topple the mat over. Per later reports of the crime scene investigation, while they were pulling the mats away, a yellow folder, a physical sciences textbook, and one tennis shoe that had been on top of the mats were knocked to the floor. As the rescue attempt was underway, 911 was called. The reports weren't consistent about the identity of the individual who called 911 on the recording we played in episode 1, or how many calls were actually placed. When they finally reached KJ, they pulled the mat over onto its side, and approximately 1/3 of KJ's body slid out of the bottom of the mat. Mr. Peploe realized immediately that nothing could be done. He told all of the students to leave the gym and go over to the new gym. At 10:32 a.m., Sergeant Adams received a call from dispatch regarding a code blue. In an interview several years after the incident, the EMT on site explained that code blue means cardiac arrest. At 10:35 a.m., Adams and another deputy, Carrie Quinn, arrived at the old gym. Adams says he observed students running out of the gym and overheard some of them saying, quote, "That was a dead body." As he approached the corner of the gym, he detected a mild odor of decomposition. The gym teacher, Mr. Peploe, was bent over a few feet away from the body and said, quote, "I don't think anyone can help him." 21 rolled-up gym mats had been stored both vertically and horizontally in that corner. Just to clarify the exact situation in the gym where the mats were stored, these mats were stored directly next to a set of bleachers. A few sources have stated that KJ would have had to climb or jump up onto the mats, and that would have been difficult because they were 6 feet tall standing up, and KJ was only about 5'10". But that's not the case. The bleachers provided a staircase to the top of the mats, and kids were often up there just as they had climbed up there that morning. The mats had been flung about in the rescue attempt, so conditions would have been different than they had been that morning. Adams observed a rolled-up mat lying horizontally on the floor. The diameter of the mat was about 3 feet across, with a middle opening of about 14 inches. It could be confirmed that the diameter of the mat, or the opening, would not have been altered when the mat was knocked over, because these wrestling mats need to be rolled with a special machine and are then securely fastened with a heavy-duty Velcro strap. Looking into the mat on one end, Adams could see there were 2 feet with white socks and the lower body of a person wearing denim jeans. The officers had to move 3 additional standing mats to get to the other end of the mat, and upon further inspection, they saw that the person, previously fully inside the mat but now partially outside the mat, was certainly deceased. Some sources have stated that the school was put into a lockdown. However, upon further research, we've determined that the school was put into a partial lockdown. Apart from law enforcement personnel, no one was allowed to leave or enter the building, and the students were free to move about between classes. However, the students who were in the gym when KJ was found were sent to the new gym and sequestered, most likely to prevent or try to prevent rumors from spreading fear amongst the students. One of the criticisms that comes up later in this case is that the school carried on almost as usual. Classes were happening, students were going from class to class, and to some it appeared that law enforcement didn't take this seriously enough by not putting the school into a total lockdown. Before 2:30 in the afternoon, students were allowed to leave the school. One such student was Kendrick Johnson, KJ's older sister, who was on her way to pay a visit to Bruce. We discussed that altercation in episode 1. When we spoke to Stride Jones, he explained that they spent a great deal of time investigating Bruce in the aftermath of KJ's death.
That was one of the leads we followed up on. I don't know. I really can't speak to how big of impact it had outside of the investigation. But I can tell you, we put many hours running down that lead and following up on it.
Shortly after the body was made accessible, 3 firefighters and 2 paramedics arrived on the scene. A first responder on the scene declared that rigor mortis had already set in. Rigor mortis is a stiffening of the muscles that occurs after death when ATP, an energy molecule that exists in all living cells, decreases to critical levels in the body. During the peak state of rigor mortis, a body is functionally frozen in the position that it's in and cannot be repositioned. At 10:43 a.m., dispatch was advised that they needed to send in homicide detectives. Sergeant Adams and Deputy Quinn then began establishing a crime scene perimeter with crime scene tape and ensuring the scene was secured and contained. The investigation was then turned over to Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or GBI, criminalist Jack Winningham. It is my understanding that Detective Winningham was responsible for overseeing all of the investigation in the school. However, all evidence was collected and contained by the criminalist James D. Thornton, who worked for the Valdosta Lowndes Regional Crime Laboratory, or VLRCL. For the context of this case, Dr. Thornton is the only individual of authority in this investigation that is Black. Investigators included personnel from the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, the Valdosta Lowndes Regional Crime Laboratory, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The next step of the investigation consisted of criminalist James Thornton taking a video of the entire gym. We will put a copy of this crime scene video up on our public Patreon post for this episode.
The investigation consisted of interviewing, and this process took several days, but we interviewed all the students that were in the class, all the teachers that were there at that period, and our crime scene people, along with the crime scene investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation assisted, and there were, I believe, some other agencies there as well. I don't know what their direct role was at that initial time, but I mean, we treated the scene as a scene, and secured it and began the investigative efforts.
Once the crime scene had been secured, a 3-dimensional scan using the Leica C10 scanning system was conducted.
Well, again, just like you stated, there has been a lot of unfair and inaccurate information spread by social media. One of those claimed that we only took 7 or 8, a small amount of crime scene photographs, when in actuality there were over 500 photographs taken of this particular investigation. There was also a 3D image created of the entire gym where Kendrick was found, so that we could create a 3D image at any time that this crime scene needed to be recreated and examined.
The Leica 3D scanning system is a camera/laser scanner that can be placed in the center of a crime scene and will take a complete 3-dimensional image of everything in the area. In effect, it allows investigators to go back into the crime scene exactly as it looked at the time and move through it in a virtual environment at any subsequent point that they wish. The environment can be manipulated in 360 degrees from any point within the captured area, and it also allows for a much more concise description and representation of a crime scene during any court proceedings that follow. It immediately allows for measurements to be taken between, for example, a victim and a weapon, or verifying what a potential witness may have seen from their point of view. It can also link crime scene photos or reports directly with tagged images captured at the scene just by clicking on the tags. All of these things can be double-checked at any point in the future, exactly as if a person were looking at the actual crime scene again. It's quite likely that the quality of images has improved with time, but I looked at some of the videos of how the Leica C10 presented images in 2013, and they were on par with the video game quality for the time, and more than sufficient. We have a video of the Leica technology at work available on our Patreon public feed if you're interested in seeing how it works. Investigators then did a complete walkthrough. Over 500 photographs were taken of the gym and the outside areas, and all interior and exterior trash cans in the area were searched. All the technicians and police officers on the scene were wearing nitrile gloves, which are a more durable alternative to commonplace latex gloves. However, they were not wearing shoe coverings. One of the complaints that has been levied against the investigators in this case is that they were not wearing full protective equipment. The crime lab report created by Dr. James Thornton noted several items that were tagged and photographed during the investigation. Directly in front of the mats, there was a yellow folder that contained KJ's report card, a blue physical science textbook also belonging to KJ, one black and white size 9.5 Adidas shoe, and a gray Hollister hoodie. Right next to KJ's head was the match to the size 9.5 Adidas shoe. Inside the mat, nestled behind his legs, was a pair of orange and white Nikes. That was the pair of shoes that KJ had worn into the gym that day. The crime scene video also showed candy wrappers, trash, as well as a buildup of dust and dirt right near KJ's body where the mat had previously been sitting. Dark brown stains containing both spatter and dripping patterns were found on the south wall of the gym. The stains were positive for blood and samples were collected.
There was DNA testing on that blood, and it was not Kendrick's.
There was also a pair of black and gray Nike shoes with orange laces that were near the bleachers on the north wall of the gymnasium. The two shoes were a fair distance apart from each other and about as far away from the body as they could be. One shoe also had brown stains. Crime scene investigators used the same presumptive blood test that had been used on the wall, and the test indicated that these stains were not blood. This pair of shoes were the only ones not collected.
No, and that has been somewhat misleading about the placement of that shoe. While it is true it was inside the gym, it was actually located on the opposite side of the gym. And I'm guessing here, probably 60 or 70 foot from the location where Kendrick was found. So it was not in direct connection to what I'm going to refer to as the immediate scene. Now, there were two other pairs of shoes. And if you're familiar with the photographs, but the photograph of Kendrick's feet protruding what would be upward. Inside the mat, there's a pair of shoes behind his legs resting on his buttocks. Those were identified by his family as being Kendrick's shoes. And the shoe that was found inside the mat with him, which is the black with the white accent, was also identified by his family as being his shoes.
Investigators showed KJ's sister, Kenyatta, a picture of all three pairs of shoes. Kenyatta confirmed that the two pairs that were near KJ's body did belong to him, but the black and gray Nikes with the orange laces with the brown stains on them did not belong to KJ. The items that were tagged and taken into evidence consisted of both of the black and white Adidas shoes, the shoe that was near KJ's head inside the mat and the one that was in front of the mat, the folder and the textbook that belonged to KJ, the gray Hollister hoodie in front of the mats, the gray, orange, and white Nike shoes that had been inside the mat with KJ, the LG cell phone, the samples taken from the bloodstain on the wall, some blood-stained paper towels that had been found in the girls' washroom. Per investigator Thornton's report, all of the items taken into evidence were put in his crime scene vehicle, locked and secured, and he was the only one who had a key. In another part of the school, 2 Lowndes County detectives were going through the videotape surveillance of the school in the hours before KJ was last seen. They determined from the footage that the last time that KJ was seen on the cameras was at approximately 1:27 p.m. on January 10th, and that he had entered the old gym, but there was no record of him leaving. The detectives requested a copy of the video surveillance for the entire wing of the school where the old gym was located for the 48 hours before the body was discovered, but they were told by the school's IT manager that it would take a few days because there were over 40 cameras on that side of the school. The copy of the video was obtained the following Monday, January 14th, according to a report made by Detective Jack Pretty. Many people have stated they believed police should have gotten a judge's warrant right there and taken all of the surveillance system hard drives in the entire school. Early in the investigation, the Johnsons announced the school had refused to give them the security footage collected on the day KJ went missing. This was not untrue. In fact, they would not even have been able to give the footage to the investigators without a warrant. In the U.S., there is a federal law which prohibits the distribution of any media regarding an underage student, including their images in videos or photographs. This is called FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It is a serious offense to violate this law, and it can cause a school to lose any government funding.
Yep, that was probably my first step out the door of the NAACP. I was on a statewide conference call, so there were presidents and secretaries from branches all around the state of Georgia, plus the state leadership, and they had Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and Shaveen King, and once again, they, first, Shaveen King and the Johnsons said that the school was stonewalling them and would not give them
I don't know, they weren't answering open records requests, wouldn't give them the videotape, they couldn't get the autopsy from the GBI. I had everything except the videotape. You can't give the videotape because at that point in time, there's a law called FERPA, which is Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So a video inside a school is considered an educational record, and you have to blur the students' faces. So the school needed a court order to release it.
This means that legally the school could not release the video footage to a third party without a judge's warrant because it contained images of other students. However, according to Lee Touchton, the school was willing to compromise with the Johnsons and allow them to come to the school and review the footage from the source. While crime scene investigators were conducting their investigation in the gym, in other parts of the school, detectives were meeting with teachers and students to take eyewitness statements and gather more information.
We immediately started interviewing people on January 11th, 2013. We interviewed people up until May as part of the initial investigation when the first decision was made to close the case.
As part of the investigation questioning witnesses, students, and staff members, Jack Winningham took a statement from a student stating he and KJ shared the pair of black and white Adidas that were found near KJ's body for gym classes. He said that they would both put the shoes in the mats in the old gym. Detective Winningham also spoke to at least one other student who said that sharing shoes was something that other students did as well, and normally what the kids would do would be tip over the standing mats where the shoes were stored and kick the shoes out from underneath.
The students brought us that information, and there's actually written statements in the file from at least two individuals who said they knew that Kendrick stored his shoes in there because they shared shoes with him. They had different physical workout classes at different times of the day, and one of them would use the shoes in the early part of the day, and then Kendrick had it the last block of the day, so he would just go by and get them. Now, when we asked the young man, he had not used them because they had just returned back to school from Christmas break. So there again, the mat that contained the shoes prior to Christmas break most likely was on the outside of the stack. But just before Christmas break, the coaches had the students roll all the mats up and push them up in that corner. So now the mat which contained the shoes that was originally on the outside of the stack is now in the middle somewhere. So it's surrounded. So he could not have went up there and just tilted it over like he had been doing and the other students had been doing.
The county coroner, Wilbur Watson, arrived on the scene at around 4 o'clock that afternoon. When he investigated the body, he discovered an LG cell phone in the front pocket of KJ's jeans. Subsequent investigation discovered that this phone actually belonged to a cousin of KJ's and it had no service. It's believed that KJ was just using it to listen to music. This cousin has been investigated thoroughly, and we will not be discussing him to protect his anonymity, as he had no involvement in this case. The body was not removed from the mat until Coroner Wilbur Watson arrived on the scene and he did his examination.
The coroner is an elected official elected in each independent county, and their specific responsibility is the pronouncement of death as well as arranging for the transport of the decedent. In some cases, that is done by the coroner's office themselves, local funeral homes, or contract transport companies, as was done with the Kendrick Johnson death.
Available crime scene photos from the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office investigative file will be available on our Patreon for those of you with the stomach to look at them. Many of them are very graphic. For those of you without the nerve, imagine a Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaign poster with uncensored photos of an unrecognizable car accident victim. Looking at a photo of KJ after his discovery, one could definitely be forgiven for assuming there was severe trauma to the head and the face, and that therefore he had been beaten and murdered. In one photo, taken after the coroner checked the body is in the same posture it would have been in the mat due to rigor mortis. Most of his upper torso can't be seen because he's wearing a white shirt layered over an orange shirt, and they are both pulled up quite high, obscuring his upper torso and neck. His right forearm is up over his eyes and forehead, and his left arm is beside his body, bent at the elbow with his hand and fingers slightly curled below his chin. Wires from a pair of earbuds were loosely wrapped around the fingers of his left hand. His head appears to be lying in a large pool of blood. In this photo, we can see that KJ was wearing a pair of jeans with a belt, black shorts under them, and a pair of blue and white striped boxer shorts under those. In some photos, KJ's jeans are unbuttoned and all 3 layers are pulled down slightly. In photos taken before this one, the jeans were fully buckled, but part of the coroner's responsibilities is checking the temperature of the body. Therefore, those photos were taken after a rectal temperature reading was taken. In photos where KJ's face was more visible, it is clear that his head and face were swollen beyond recognition. In fact, the only reason police were able to identify him as the missing boy was because of his long dreadlocks. His eyes were swollen shut, and his nose and lips were compressed towards the left side of his face. If you've ever seen an MMA fighter who's had their nose broken more than once and had not had it reset, you can get some idea of what KJ's nose looked like. There was dried blood and vomit all over his face and in his hair, and in the pre-autopsy photos taken at the GBI medical examiner's office, you can see that KJ's chest and shoulders looked bruised and mottled just like his face. According to the EMT report, it was the, quote, cruise impression that the cause of death was cardiac arrest. While cardiac arrest can mean heart attack, it can also be a catch-all term for causes of death yet unknown. Regardless of what happened, your heart is not beating and therefore you are dead. The EMT report, which we mentioned briefly in episode 1, notes that bruising can be seen on the right jaw, and there is lividity and mottling to the face and arms. Mottling is a presence of reddish or purplish blotches on the skin, which form when the heart is no longer pumping blood effectively. It is most likely to begin in the extremities and is most commonly seen in terminally ill patients in the last weeks before their death. Lividity is also discoloration of the skin, but it is caused by the heart no longer pumping blood at all. Without the pressure of the heart beating to move blood through the body, the blood pools in the gravitational lowest point of the body. In cases where someone is found deceased in their home, for example, lividity is usually spread along whichever side of the body is resting against the surface they're found on. A person on their back would have no noticeable lividity in the face. In KJ's case, because he was inverted, the blood pooled in his head, shoulders, and arms, so the EMT noted that it was lividity that was present in those areas. After the discovery, Eddie Tooley, KJ's grandfather, who we spoke about in episode 1, was shown a black and white image of KJ's body, and KJ's sister Kenyatta was shown the pictures of the 5 shoes.
As callous as it may seem, when a person passes away and there's any suspicious circumstance, that body becomes a piece of evidence. Our number one goal is to preserve any and all evidence. Kendrick was identified by another family member that night on January 11th by a photograph. We also were able to show the photographs of the shoes to a family member who confirmed that Kendrick wore those type shoes.
Mr. Tooley told police he recognized the image of KJ, but if you'll recall from episode 1, he later told the press he didn't know for sure that it was KJ. Either way, we do know that it was. As I mentioned, Kenyatta was able to identify 2 pairs of the shoes as belonging to KJ, but did not recognize the lone shoe with the orange laces.
So those 2 things coupled together were sufficient to identify that this was the body of Kendrick Johnson.
If you'll remember from episode 1, Coroner Wilbur Watson was going on record to air his grievances about how the investigation was handled, drawing particular attention to not being called to the scene for 6 hours after the discovery of the body. According to a video made by one of our sources, Lee Touchton, there was some bad blood between Wilbur Watson and Sheriff Chris Prine before they even became involved in the death of KJ Johnson.
Now, let me explain why Bill Watson and Sheriff Chris Prine had such a contentious relationship. Bill Watson had also been involved in the death of James Eunice, who drowned in Ocean Pond. He was also another young person in Lowndes County. His body was not found for 2 weeks. He drowned. We know he drowned because his friend was out there with him, and the skiff was found, and James Eunice was not found. So the team searched the pond for 2 weeks until they finally found him. The sheriff insisted that the coroner remain at the scene
He was there for 2 weeks waiting for the body to be found. And the reason for that was because the sheriff wanted the coroner on scene because there were allegations or questions that there might have been foul play, and he wanted the coroner there immediately to take custody of the body. Well, Bill Watson sitting around for 2 weeks didn't make him happy.
Sheriff Prine explained that the reason the coroner was not called immediately when KJ was found was that there would have been nothing for him to do, and he would once again have to sit in his car for several hours while they investigated the potential crime scene. The following is a clip we've acquired of Lee Touchton from an interview regarding her involvement in the case.
Does the coroner bear a ton of responsibility for bad mistakes in this case? Yes. And I don't know how much time you have, but one of the first things he did was he gave interviews to the media saying that because he was not called immediately, it corrupted his investigation. It absolutely did not corrupt his investigation. He does not conduct the investigation. He relies on what the trained professionals tell him. His background is in funeral embalming and in funeral transport. He has taken a 1 or 2 week class in how to be a coroner. That's it. So he could not have looked at that body and determined anything about how Kendrick might have died. Nothing.
In your acquisition of true crime knowledge, you may have heard the terms coroner and medical examiner be used interchangeably. It's not entirely accurate to say that isn't true, but it's also not entirely accurate to say that it is. When asked in an interview what they thought a coroner's job was, some members of the Johnson family, as well as other Georgian residents, had this to say.
A coroner is somebody who's the first call when somebody is murdered, and they go in and see if there was foul play or how they died.
A coroner is someone who is supposed to review the body using their knowledge that they were taught to properly give an answer to what happened. They're supposed to tell us the truth. They're not supposed to be biased. And unfortunately, the coroner in this situation, in my opinion, was extremely biased and extremely dishonest and unethical in his work.
What it is, a medical examiner, pretty much to examine,
I know the coroner is the person that come in, tell you, supposed to be able to tell you how did that person die and what time did he passed.
Coroner, they come and pick up the body and basically tell you what happened to it before they do the autopsy.
A coroner is the person that the county has hired to keep integrity in investigating when there is a murder. They are supposed to look at every angle and look at that body to find any reason that this murder could have happened by whom, whatever, however. They're supposed to look into ballistics and things of that magnitude. But I didn't see any of that really going on with my brother-in-law's death, let alone with Kendrick Johnson's death, that made me feel at ease as a citizen.
They come with a special set of skill sets, that being of the medical and that being of scientific reasoning, and knowing that their role is that to handle the final remains of your loved one, and to also do that within the ethical guidelines that has been prescribed to them.
Further, when asked if a coroner should have medical training,
I mean, this is a medical situation. You're dealing with the deceased. You actually opening up the body and playing with organs and preparing the face and healing wounds. So you're actually a doctor, a physician for the dead. So, as a physician, you expect this to be a clinically trained individual.
You have to have some type of medical background or something to know what a person died from or what was the cause of death.
He need to have all kind of experience, I believe. I would think he need to have some kind of medical background. He need to know what he's looking at.
I would say same as a medical examiner should be. Same as a medical examiner's office, same as a mortician. I would think a coroner needs to know any and everything about dealing with the deceased.
Each state defines the roles differently and has different requirements for each. Some states have a coroner or a medical examiner, in which case whichever one they do have is a medical doctor responsible for performing autopsies, determining cause of death, filing reports, and testifying at trial as a medical expert. Some states, however, have both a coroner and a medical examiner. So, for the sake of clarity, and to clear up what has been a huge point of contention in this case, we need to clearly define these roles for the state of Georgia. Georgia is a state that has what's called a county-based medical death investigation system, and it employs both county coroners and medical examiners. A medical examiner is appointed to their position within the GBI and must meet the following requirements. They must be a pathologist certified in forensic pathology by the American Board of Pathology. In other words, they must be a medical doctor that has completed medical school and been certified. As of 2024, there are 12 medical examiners in the GBI Medical Examiner's Office. There are 4 counties in Georgia which have their own medical examiner offices, but Lowndes County is not one of them. The medical examiner is responsible for determining cause and manner of death by performing autopsies and other post-mortem examinations. A coroner is elected to their position in each county and holds their position for a period of 4 years. In order to be eligible, the following requirements must be met. They must be a citizen of the United States. They must have resided in the county where they intend to hold office for a minimum of 2 years and must continue to reside there during the entirety of their term. They must be a registered voter. They must be 25 years old in order to run for office. They cannot run even if they would be 25 by the time they take office. They must have a high school diploma or recognized equivalent unless they have been serving prior to 1980. They cannot have been convicted of a felony or any offense involving moral turpitude in any state in the United States. An offense involving moral turpitude does not have to be a felony, but does have to demonstrate an inherently evil intent. Upon election, they must complete the soonest available basic coroner training course provided by the Georgia Police Academy. A coroner is responsible for signing the death certificate, classifying manner of death as natural, accidental, homicide, suicide, or undetermined, and providing a coroner's seal to ensure the chain of custody is maintained. The coroner is also technically responsible for transporting the body to a temporary storage facility, in this case the Lowndes Valdosta Regional Crime Lab body coolers, while it is awaiting transport to the GBI for autopsy or while arrangements are being made to transport it to a funeral home. That does not mean the coroner needs to transport the body themselves, but they are responsible for designating an authorized proxy. In this case, the person who transported KJ's body was Steve Owens, the owner of a private transport company called Owens Transport Services, and not actually employed by either the county or the state. With all of this in mind, we need to remember Wilbur Watson is the county coroner and not the medical examiner. We will discuss the medical examiner that conducted the first autopsy again shortly.
For some reason, I don't know why, he decided to get out there publicly and basically throw a firebomb that caused a train wreck in the realm of public relations, and it caused everybody who was watching this case to say, because people are thinking the coroner is a trained medical professional, and people are thinking, oh my God, if he says this investigation was corrupt, then it must be corrupt and we'll never know how Kendrick was murdered. Meanwhile, all of the people with years and years of training from the Valdosta Crime Lab, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Department, they're all processing the scene, and then you've got medical examiners in the Macon Scientific Medical Laboratory who are also processing the body. All of this trained experience over here, and we have one very outrageous statement made publicly in the media by a man who does not know how the forensic investigation is conducted.
In order to demonstrate the power a coroner actually has in investigations, I'm going to pause for a moment and discuss a separate case that Watson was involved in. In 2012, a young woman named Jasmine Benjamin was found deceased in her dorm room at Valdosta State University. Watson, who'd been elected to the coroner's position in 2008, was the coroner called to the scene when she was found. At the scene, Watson classified her manner of death as being from natural causes, but it was quickly discovered that Jasmine Benjamin had been the victim of a homicide. She had been strangled. Her boyfriend, Darian Mayhew, was convicted of her murder and was given a life sentence in March of 2015.
After everything that happened with the Kendrick Johnson case, and not just with the Kendrick Johnson case, there was also an issue with the Jasmine Benjamin death by homicide at Valdosta State University. But the worst aspects of not having a trained medical professional be a coroner, the absolute worst things have happened in the Kendrick Johnson case. I don't think there's another case in the country where the things have gone so badly.
If someone hadn't caught this error, the case wouldn't have been escalated to the medical examiner for investigation, and her killer may never have been brought to justice. As you can imagine, this brought to the limelight some questions about how many homicides have been overlooked in the past, and raised concerns that coroners may rely too heavily on what law enforcement tells them and feel pressured by law enforcement to come to conclusions that support a certain narrative. There has been a push in recent years for a requirement that coroners be medically trained, not necessarily medical doctors, but at least have similar training to a nurse or a paramedic. Now that we've derailed for a bit, let's get back into how Watson influenced the case. One last thing to mention with regards to the coroner's portion of the investigation, the CNN interview of Watson we played in the previous episode took place before Watson became aware of a crucial fact about the crime scene. He asserted that the crime scene being disturbed and the body being moved was a sign of the negligence apparent in the investigation, but he wasn't aware that the movement of the body and disturbing of the scene was actually done in the attempts made by Lowndes High School students and faculty to provide aid to KJ before police even arrived. After Watson completed his duties on scene, the body was transported to the Valdosta Lowndes Regional Crime Laboratory. In his report, Dr. James Thornton states KJ arrived at approximately 5:30 p.m. and he was placed in a body cooler. The evidence collected from the crime scene was placed in the laboratory's temporary evidence locker, and investigator Thornton states that he maintained the only keys. The report took inventory of the evidence which had been placed into a drying cabinet in the evidence locker because they were soaked with blood or bodily fluids. These items were bloody paper towels that were found in the girls' washroom, a pair of gray, white, and orange Nike shoes that were found inside the mat next to KJ's legs, one of the black and white Adidas shoes, the one seen in the crime scene photo near KJ's head. If you've been paying attention, the only blood pool found on the scene was underneath KJ's head at the bottom of the vertical mat, and you may be wondering how the shoes, which were behind his legs in the mat, would have ended up in the drying cabinet. We also had trouble explaining this, but one of the sources close to the investigation, who has requested to remain anonymous, informed us that during the process of removing KJ's body from the mat, the shoes were pulled out with him and dragged under the body through the pooled fluids on the floor. In addition to the blood, there was vomit and additional fluids related to decomposition found on the shoes. We have the full list of evidence collected at the scene available on our Patreon if you're interested in reviewing it, but we've gone over the most important items here. If you recall, the public firestorm was ignited on the same day KJ was found when Sheriff Chris Prine released a statement saying,
"Although the exact cause of death is yet to be determined, as of this stage of the investigation, nothing has been discovered to indicate foul play was involved."
What was also said in the statement, but is often neglected in the retellings, was,
"An autopsy will be conducted on Monday by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Medical Examiner's Office to attempt to determine an exact cause of death."
Prine made efforts to clarify the statement shortly after its release, but the family was already fuming over the apparent claim that no homicide had occurred and took it as confirmation that the local police either had no intention of investigating properly or were actively implementing a cover-up. To paraphrase what they told reporters at the time, how could they possibly know this soon, especially given the circumstances that there wasn't evidence of an assault on the body? From discussions with our sources close to the case, the joint statement from Prine and Superintendent Wes Taylor was released because they were feeling the pressure of a community scared that a campus killer might be on the loose among their children. In an attempt to dispel fear, the authorities engendered anger. As we mentioned in episode 1, Watson had voiced his frustration that the coroner's seal placed on the body bag to maintain the chain of custody had been broken prematurely to allow Kenneth Johnson to see his son's remains. This may not seem like such a big deal in this case, but had the events surrounding KJ's death been different, this mistake, and it was a big mistake, could have been disastrous for everyone involved. Stride Jones explains.
I don't know that we would categorize it as a mistake. On Sunday, which would have been January 13th, due to compassion for the Johnson family, we did allow Mr. Johnson to view Kendrick at the storage facility where Kendrick's body had been stored. We probably should not have done that, But again, that was done out of compassion. The family wanting to see their son. This family was experiencing absolutely the worst event that any mother and father could ever go through. And we understood that. But again, once, when Mr. Johnson was allowed to see his son, he was not allowed to touch the body in any way or to in any way change things as they were.
In this case, the breach of protocol never negatively impacted the investigation, but that doesn't mean it should be taken lightly. As Lee Touchton says,
the coroner should not have ever allowed the body bag to be opened because a body is physical evidence and the chain of custody must be preserved. However, now that the family has been so upset about the way that the case is being handled, Sheriff Prine felt very pressured to allow them to come see Kendrick's body. So he allowed them to see the body. It shouldn't have happened, but he did. If KJ had been murdered, the defense attorney for the defendant would have claimed, and rightfully so, that potentially evidence could have been planted or tampered with, and by so doing, it might implicate falsely his defendant that he's representing. That's why you don't let the body bag be opened by anyone except medical and crime scene and law enforcement personnel. But in this case, the sheriff allowed the family to see the body.
Now it's time to go over these autopsies. If you recall from episode 1, there will be 3 total autopsies conducted. I'm going to do my best as a layman to explain what occurred in these autopsies and what the findings were. The first autopsy was performed at the GBI Medical Examiner's Office in Macon, Georgia, by Dr. Marianne Gaffney Kraft. Just to give you a little background information, Dr. Gaffney Kraft has a doctoral degree in osteopathic medicine. From everything I've been able to find about her, she is a well-respected, very experienced pathologist, and her findings have never been called into question before or since the KJ Johnson investigation. Although the autopsy report is dated May 2, 2013, it says the autopsy was conducted on January 14, 2013. In the section of the report called Presentation of the Body, the medical examiner makes mention of congestive decomposition changes to the head, neck, and upper torso. The report goes into detail on exactly what those changes are, but for our purposes, it's not important. The whole report is available on our Patreon if you'd like to read it. Basically, those changes are why he had appeared as beat up as he did. The autopsy report indicates that the organs were removed and weighed, and that there was advanced decomposition in the organs, with the decomposition worsening as it progressed from bottom to top. It states that the right and left lungs weighed 260 and 240 grams respectively. KJ's head and body were x-rayed to check for any fractures, and none were found. Under injuries, the examiner made note of 3 superficial abrasions on his left hand and right wrist. A superficial abrasion is a minor wound limited to the skin's surface, which likely did not cause bleeding. It's also noted in the autopsy that KJ Johnson's fingernails were intact, trimmed, and worn short, with no obvious foreign body material present. If you recall from episode 1, Benjamin Crump, the Johnsons' lawyer, was making claims that the fingernails had been either cut down to the cuticle or removed entirely in order to destroy evidence. In addition to this report, that claim can also be easily disproved because KJ's fingernails, showing signs of cyanosis and normal bodily effect after death, are clearly visible in the crime scene and autopsy photos where you can see his hands. The toxicology report came back negative for cocaine or opioids, and all other factors explored in the autopsy were reported to be normal for a well-nourished teenage male. The report ends with, given the complete autopsy, including toxicology and histology, the scene photographs, the scene forensic testing, the law enforcement investigative findings, including crime scene investigator report and witness statements, and the coroner's findings, it is my opinion that the cause of death in this case is positional asphyxia, and the manner of death is accident. To review from episode 1, in order for a diagnosis of positional asphyxia to be made, 3 things are required. 1, the body must obstruct normal gas exchange, or the ability to breathe. 2, it must be impossible to move to another position. 3, other causes of natural or violent death must be excluded. In our research, we listened to a podcast called Autopsy, and the first episode on KJ Johnson goes through the autopsy performed by Dr. Gaffney Kraft in great detail. The host stated that based on his knowledge of autopsies, the autopsy performed on KJ was much more extensive than a typical autopsy. Not only did she take x-rays, she dissected KJ's back and neck looking for injuries that may have resulted from a beating. During an autopsy, a prosector, in other words the person doing the autopsy, who is usually a pathologist, dissects a body for examination by dissecting layer by layer, cutting into the body only a tiny bit at a time to check for any hemorrhages in each layer. On our Patreon, there is a photo showing the dissection of KJ's neck and back for anyone who would like to see it. And from looking, it appears that Dr. Gaffney Kraft did a thorough dissection of the area. Essentially, his entire back and the back of his neck were dissected and spread open to check for injuries. As mentioned, the only injuries noted were those superficial abrasions on the hand and wrist. I recommend anyone interested in this section to listen to the autopsy podcast. We will provide a link for that in the show notes. To summarize up until this point, a full and comprehensive, if somewhat flawed, investigation was performed by the Lowndes County Sheriff's Department, and a competent, thorough autopsy was performed by the GBI Medical Examiner's Office. As I mentioned, we will be putting up extensive documentation on our Patreon to provide further clarity on every aspect of the investigation, and we are available to answer any questions, when we can, if you email us at evilliespodcast@manslaughtermedia.com. We apologize in advance if there is a significant delay in getting back to you. As with any controversial case, there will undoubtedly be some hate mail to sift through. In our interview with Captain Stride Jones, he brought up something interesting about the investigation.
The decision to close the case was really kind of a twofold. Number one, being the family had repeatedly requested copies of to see the investigative file. And in the state of Georgia, as long as the case is open, they cannot see that because it's not public record. By closing the file, that gives the family access to receive copies of the file, which they did.
As we know, the initial investigation was closed during the last week of May in 2013. But when one closes, another opens, as they say, and two civil rights groups, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, led by the Reverend Floyd Rose, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, led by Lee Touchton, arrive on the investigative scene the same month. The two institutions had followed the case as it progressed, and they jumped at the chance to investigate it themselves when they saw the fierce and perpetual denial that the public was expressing about the results of the first investigation. The public was thrilled when two highly respected leaders of the civil rights movement stepped in to lead their own investigations. For our coverage of the NAACP investigation, since we did an interview with Lee Touchton, we feel it's best to allow her to explain what she did.
So this horrible, tragic death occurs right there at Lowndes High School. And immediately the state district coordinator called me and asked me to assemble the legal redress team and to start investigating. And a secretary of a branch, along with the president of the branch, they are really the two that go out and file the open records request and interview as many people as possible. Well, while the Sheriff's Department investigation was going on, obviously we couldn't interview anyone because the investigation was not closed. So we had to wait until they closed the investigation. And then we were both, the president and I, we were both allowed to sit down with Sheriff Prine, with the lawyer for the school, with the superintendent, with an IT guy, with a coach. So we talked to all kinds of people. I was allowed to talk to one of the school resource officers. So we talked to everybody. We wrote open records requests. We got all of this information. We got the case file. We went over it. We toured the crime lab. Both of us did. I ended up touring the crime lab 3 times. And I talked to the director out there. Everybody we talked to, the information they gave us dovetailed with what was in the report. So we found no evidence that there was a cover-up. We found no evidence that there was a murder. Everything that we looked at, everything we heard was that this points to a tragic accident.
Keep in mind that while this is supposed to be a coverage of both the NAACP and SCLC investigation, it is our understanding that the steps taken by both organizations were nearly, if not entirely, identical.
So I resigned from the NAACP, I immediately went back to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they voted me into what they called the lead investigator position. And so I basically repeated all of the steps that I had taken in the NAACP. I wrote the open records request, went around and interviewed people. Reverend Rose went with me to interview some people. So we found the same thing.
The following is an excerpt from a journalist that we spoke to, David Whitley.
You know, the first person I contacted up there was Lee Touchton, who was the head of the NAACP, and she and we had it was almost a comical in a way, because she was very suspicious at first of who I was, and I could tell then that they had already, been through caught a lot of flack for what was going on, and that there was a lot of tension in that city. And when we met, she wanted to see my ID and everything to make sure I wasn't some surreptitious person coming to working for the other side, if you break it down to the sides, or whatever the case may be. So we sat down, we had a long talk, and she explained a lot to me. And I mean everybody knows the basics by now on how Kendrick Johnson passed away and everything, and I just said, well, what is your gut on all this? And she said, there's no doubt in my mind that it was just a tragic accident, and it has just been turned into a political football here. And what struck me was how she was not the kind of person who would come in and I mean, obviously at the root of all this is the racial component, and how if you think back to that time, this was really the start of it was pre-George Floyd, but those elements were still there. A black kid, although George Floyd wasn't a kid, but a black person, died in mysterious circumstances. This was after the Ferguson, Missouri situation with Michael Brown, and I mean, goodness knows everybody knew about that one. Even in our own backyard in Orlando, Trayvon Martin was a case, had captured, a lot of attention. And that was the same thing where, a black kid was died, and a white person was implicated in it. And so, that element, it could not be avoided. And obviously it was, I was thinking, well, this is going to be broken down along racial lines a lot. But given that, I thought, well, the NAACP would probably be much more in line with the Johnson story, that their son was murdered by Brian Bell. But Lee Touchton, who had been NAACP president there for, I don't know how long, she said she conducted her investigation, talked to everybody, and that there was no evidence and no real reason to think Brian Bell was the person who killed Kendrick Johnson, and that it was just an accident. Of course, it should be noted, of course, that Lee Touchton is a white woman, and that hurt her credibility, at least in the eyes, I think, of a lot of people in the black community. That even though she had been the president of NAACP there and received all sorts of commendations and awards for her civil rights work, just the fact that she was white made her findings sort of questionable in a lot of people's eyes. But then she mentioned another guy, Reverend Floyd Rose, who had been in Valdosta for, I guess forever. And he was 76, 77 years old at the time. One of the leading citizens, head of a black church, I think it's Baptist church there. And he had initially, when the thing had happened, he was very sympathetic to the Johnson's case, and he said he had spearheaded a lot of the publicity that had been drummed up. He had gotten a rally going for the Johnsons, and I think he was the one who brought in Al Sharpton to come down and speak and all that. And then he was also asked to start looking into things and really take a hard look at things. And he said he came to the same conclusion as Lee Touchton, that despite his initial impressions that that it was just a terrible accident, and there was nothing to implicate Brian Bell in the whole thing. And so, given that those two people, and I thought they had credibility, I didn't see any reason to doubt what they were saying. And speaking with the lawyer of the Johnsons at the point, not the Johnsons, but of the Bells, I came to the conclusion, man, this is just crazy. And Brian Bell, unfortunately, as I said, was just made the scapegoat in this whole thing, because basically it was I never actually spoke with the Johnsons. I tried to through their lawyer, but they wouldn't. But but I went to a rally that they were having in their on their behalf once, and it was obvious in reading the social media. It was just obvious that people were just thoroughly convinced. They were thoroughly convinced that their son was murdered, and that Brian Bell was the person. And it really didn't matter what Lee Touch and the NAACP or Floyd Rose said, that they were not going to be dissuaded from what their beliefs were. Yeah, I think Floyd Rose, he is one of the heroes in this whole sordid tale, just because he was at first glance, he thought, my goodness, that something doesn't smell right here, and but he was open-minded enough, and intellectually honest enough to say, well, let me look into this. And when he did, he reported what he believed, where the facts led him. And I just don't know how, given his standing in the community, I wish that he could have convinced all those, or that would have had more sway than it apparently did. I don't know if the Johnsons what their connection was with Reverend Rose and all that, but he was all on board with him at some point, and early on, and they probably think, well, he was bought off. I mean, which is just preposterous, but I mean it's true. I mean he looked at this objectively, and this is a guy who at first wasn't looking at it objectively, but when he did, he just came to the only conclusion that anybody could come away with, and all this. And
While the NAACP and SCLC continued their investigation, an exhumation was spearheaded by Shaveen King, the Johnsons' lawyer, and Dr. William Anderson became involved. To review, Dr. Anderson is a private forensic pathologist who offers his services performing autopsies upon request when there is a dispute about a person's cause of death. He was hired by the Johnsons to perform a second autopsy, which took place on June 15, 2013. The results were released in September. The notable finding in this second autopsy is that the description of injuries differs wildly from the first report. Under the description of injuries section, Anderson says, quote, "Examination of the head and neck shows an area of contusion injury involving the right mandibular area with moderate discoloration of the skin. Examination of the previous undissected area and sectioning of the skin reveals evidence of full-thickness cutaneous hemorrhage extending into the subcutaneous fat. Further dissection into the deep soft tissue reveals hemorrhage into the musculature with extension to the periostal region of the inferior aspect of the posterior body of the right mandible." But what does this mean? Let's break it down step by step. A contusion is a bruise. Your mandible is your lower jaw. Cutaneous means affecting the skin. Subcutaneous means under the skin. Hemorrhage means the escape of blood from a ruptured blood vessel or bleeding. Periostal means the membrane of the blood vessels and nerves that wrap around the bone. Therefore, there is a bruise on his right jaw. Under the skin there is bleeding. That bleeding extends to the final membrane between KJ's skin and his jawbone. Anderson goes on to say, quote, "Examination of the right upper neck reveals hemorrhage in the deep soft tissue and musculature adjacent to the bifurcation of the right common carotid artery and carotid body." This one is a little bit easier. Soft tissue and musculature is just everything that isn't bone, and bifurcation just means there's something that divides into two parts. The common carotid artery divides into the internal and external carotid arteries at the bifurcation point. That is where Dr. Anderson states there is an observable hemorrhage. The last observation under injuries was, quote, Examination of the soft tissues of the left neck area reveals no grossly evident areas of hemorrhage. These alleged observations led him to the conclusion that the cause of death was actually blunt force trauma to the right lower jaw, neck, and carotid body consistent with inflicted injury. And I do say alleged because, unlike the first autopsy performed by the GBI medical examiner, Dr. Gaffney Kraft, there is not extensive photographic record of any of his findings. In fact, to my knowledge, there was only one photo ever released, and one other photo is blurrily featured in a documentary series called Ashes to Ash. This is a clip from that same documentary.
The neck had not been dissected where we found the injury. It was way up at the angle of the jaw, and that had not been dissected. So we dissected that area, and that's where the hemorrhage was found. And that's basically the conclusion that he died of sudden death. Not a positional asphyxia death, but sudden death. And that because of that hemorrhage in the soft tissues there, means there was force applied, either an arm across or a blow or something that essentially caused the heart to stop. Because there's a structure called the carotid body, which basically feeds back and forth to the heart. And if your blood pressure goes too high, the carotid body senses that and slows the heart down. But compression of that area can cause the heart to actually slow to the point that it briefly stops, and sometimes in the situation it doesn't restart. And I think that's probably what happened when some force was applied to that area, enough to cause the hemorrhage, that basically the heart slowed down to a point that it did not recover, or it was kept too long and didn't recover. The pressure was kept too long. That the heart basically didn't restart itself.
He also states in no uncertain terms that the findings of his autopsy are not consistent with positional asphyxia. This report is problematic. Dr. Anderson's autopsy did not undergo any peer review before it was released. According to the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts Performance Audit Operations report from 2012, peer review of autopsy reports before they are released should be standard practice with any autopsy. A source close to the case who has requested to remain anonymous also mentioned that the person who assisted Anderson in the autopsy was not even a medical professional and was unqualified to be assisting in any medical procedure. If that is true, the assistant wouldn't have the knowledge to see any discrepancies in the conclusions. In addition, there is only one public photo of the autopsy of the alleged neck hemorrhage, but we will include in the show notes a paper from the National Library of Medicine explaining articles and pitfalls in the neck at autopsy, which covers what the findings are more likely to mean. We spoke to a death investigator and autopsy technician about the report. They have requested to remain anonymous, but have permitted us to use the following quote.
Remember, these are findings he discovered months later when the body was exhumed. And he basically dissected into the jaw-mandible neck area and said that the muscle and tissue underneath showed what he believed were signs of hemorrhage. That's what he used to say, it was blunt force trauma. What he likely saw was just decomposition, discoloration of the tissue, muscle, and since he knew it was something he could never use to prove actual blunt force trauma, which leaves behind more than just a little vague discoloration, he concluded that the trauma was a single direct blow to the area, which itself wouldn't kill someone, but he theorized that the direct blow to a very specific branching of the carotid artery in the area could have stopped Kendrick's heart, which in theory could be true, but it has never, ever been used as a real cause of death in any case ever, because there's no way to prove or disprove it. And he knows that. That's why he did it. It's super shady practice. He did it because he was paid to do the examination, and he knew the family wanted it to be a homicide, so that's what he gave them. But of course, no one can prove that.
As we mentioned in episode 1, the release of the second autopsy coincided closely with the NAACP and SCLC closing their investigation, declaring they did not find any inconsistencies in the first investigation and they agreed with the findings, and the announcement by Michael Moore, U.S. Attorney for Georgia Middle District, that they were opening a third investigation. As much as we would love to be able to deep dive into this investigation as well, the records of this investigation are not available to the public, and there's a good chance they never will be. The Department of Justice is one of the only investigative bodies that is not eventually required to release their files under the Freedom of Information Act. To our knowledge, the only person in possession of those files outside of the DOJ is Sheriff Ashley Polk, who stated he could not release them to us. A shallow dive into this investigation reveals mostly what we already know. In February of 2014, Brian Bell, the prime suspect in the eyes of the public, as well as Brandon and Rick Bell, were issued target letters by the DOJ. In June of 2015, the home of Rick and Karen Bell, the college apartments of Brian and Brandon Bell, and the homes of Taylor Eakin and Ryan Hall, who we will be getting into next episode, were raided. And before the DOJ closed their investigation in June of 2016, over 100 high school students were deposed, Michael Moore resigned mysteriously and moved the case to Ohio, and the U.S. Attorney in Ohio, Stephen Dettelbach, also resigned mysteriously. The final decision of the Department of Justice was that there was not sufficient evidence of a homicide or civil rights violation to pursue any charges in relation to this case. However, we did learn a few things from a 2017 article published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This article is based on a letter which was leaked from the DOJ investigative files. Quote, "In October 2014, DA Moore was informed that the Bells have been cleared through video evidence, unbeknownst to anyone. That month, October 2014, U.S. Attorney Michael Moore revealed his true leanings in a meeting with Agents Peoples and McClendon, plus Special Agent in Charge Britt Johnson. The agents told Moore that they had found Brandon and Brian Bell, along with another targeted classmate Ryan Hall, on every possible surveillance tape during January 10, 2013. There was no way, the agents asserted, that those kids had anything to do with Kendrick Johnson's death. Moore, rather than rethink his position, sat back and said, well, maybe KJ was murdered at night. The three agents shook their heads and responded, no, he wasn't murdered at all. Britt Johnson then said that the Bureau had concluded this investigation and was closing the case. A highly irritated Moore responded they both worked for the Attorney General Holder, and thus Holder would have to make the call. Johnson replied, no, I work for FBI Director James Comey, and we are closing this case. We will not take part in this witch hunt any longer, and you are going to get jacked up on this. In 2018, Dr. Anderson performed another autopsy for the Johnsons. The body was exhumed again in June, and the results were released in November. The amended report, which looks nearly identical to the first, added the following notes under injuries. Quote, examination of the skin and soft tissues of the anterior left lower mandible area reveals areas of possible hemorrhage into the musculature. So, his amended report states that while in 2013, 5 months after the body had been embalmed and laid to rest, there was no evidence of hemorrhage on the left side of the jaw, there is now, 5 years after the body had been embalmed and laid to rest, evidence of exactly that. I feel comfortable disregarding this addendum as a crock, even without considering peer review and whether his assistant was qualified. In 2021, Sheriff Ashley Polk opened the final, to-date, investigation into the death of KJ Johnson.
I was sheriff for 16 years. So the 4 years after I retired as sheriff, I was county commission chairman. And then I had 4 years in between that where I was doing nothing politically. And so after 8 years of not being sheriff, I came back, defeated Bryan in the election. And one of the major things, the public said, we want you to look into the KJ case.
Several people who we've spoken to regard Polk quite highly and felt confident that if he promised to look into the KJ case, he was going to do it.
I know Sheriff Polk well enough to know he will leave no stone uncovered and without checking out and running down every tidbit of information.
We'll let Polk tell you a bit about his investigation.
And so when I came back 2019, well, that's 2016, excuse me, I started requesting the federal files because the federal people had done all this work, Department of Justice and the FBI, and I requested files and actually got the Johnsons to write a joint letter with me. We composed it together and asked for it, and we got a denial, so they would not give it to us. And so it rocked along, and the Johnsons got hooked up with a guy named Marcus Coleman, who is an activist out of Atlanta. He claims that he was instrumental in getting the files released. I don't know if he was or not. I think the key to getting the files released is a 7-year statute ran, which would make it where you could not prosecute people for some of the things that they did in investigating this case, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. Mm-hmm. But anyway, right before Christmas, you get a call from this assistant U.S. attorney out of Northern District of Indiana and wanted to know if they would give me the files, would I reopen the case? I said, of course I would. And so we got notification they were going to ship us the files, which was roughly 17, well, you can read it, it might be redundant, but it's in the synopsis, 17 boxes. And when we got it, I took two of my people in my detective bureau, one of them that was involved in the case from the outset, Jack Winningham, and we started going through the boxes. I would take box 1, somebody would take box 2, box 3. Then when the three of us got through with our box, we would go give the other one a box. So every box and every piece of data in every box looked at by 3 people in this department. We took notes, and it took quite a while. It took about 8 months to go through all the evidence, of course. And there's still a gag order on, giving it to the public as far as letting them look at what the federal government turned over to us. And so we sat down and went through all the notes, questions, went back through the boxes, answered some of the questions that some of us had, some of us didn't have. We corroborated on it for several months. And that resulted in the synopsis.
Upon completing his investigation, Polk released a 16-page synopsis, an overview of the events leading up to and following KJ's death, based on his review of all the previous evidence and investigations. In his synopsis, Polk states that the information was collected from approximately 17 boxes of files obtained from 11 sources, including the Department of Justice. He opens the report by addressing the rampant rumors that there is a conspiracy to cover up a murder in this case. Quote, "Any person who looks at this case objectively would know that it would be impossible to conceal any evidence due to the involvement of so many agencies and investigators. The FBI states unequivocally in its investigation that there was no cover-up or conspiracy." The remainder of the report introduces several previously unheard aspects of the case, including student testimony, possible interference in the DOJ's autopsy review, and several bullet points about how the files read, to him, like a witch hunt. Without those files, we have no way of confirming the basis for anything in his synopsis, so we won't get into them here. The synopsis is available on our Patreon for anyone who is interested in reading just what Polk's accusations are. We will also continue to try and obtain those DOJ files, even though it is a long shot. Thank you so much for listening. The next episode of The Boy in the Mat aims to dispel the lies and misinformation that have been allowed to run rampant surrounding this case, particularly in the media. It is the culmination of our efforts to determine the truth about what happened to Kendrick Johnson. Until next time.